So I bought this Type R 6 months ago. I drove it home on summer tires. The next day I put it on winter tires, went through multiple snowstorms with it, took it on some awesome roads around my area, and then inevitably I took it to autocross. So after 6 months, how is it doing? Well, let me tell you about it. Now, after 6 months, I have two conclusions that I want to get really into, but before that, we need to hit some reference points. So before the Civic Type R, I had a Subaru WRX for about 6.5 years. I currently own a Nissan 370Z Nismo that I've autocrossed as well, so that's a good comparison point for this too. Then my wife has owned an Audi A3 that I drove around, and she got rid of that and now owns a Mercedes A220 that I drive around a lot, and we have actually just taken on a big road trip. So some reference points there for when I start talking about this car. Now let's get into it. So I've done about 5 or 6 of these long-term reviews on multiple of my cars, and I always start with reliability. That's where I'm going to start here, but the thing is, nothing's wrong. It's been 6 months. Any new car should be fine after 6 months. This is a Honda. It has been fine, and there's been no issues as well, even after coming back from autocross. Sometimes in cars, you go through autocross, you come back, you drive home, and things feel a little weird or a little different, but this felt perfectly fine hopping back on the freeway. No problems at all. So let's move on to the next thing. I want to touch on exterior styling very briefly because it's not a long-term update. Basically, I'm 30 now, I'm old. I used to love the Fast and Furious look. I don't love it as much anymore. The styling is obviously exaggerated. It's over the top. A lot of people like it. I like it in black because all the black trim, which creates a lot of the crazy styling, is all muted on a black car because all the trim blends in and all the lines blend into the black paint. So I kind of like it in black, and other colors not as much, but it's fine. It's subjective. It's all personal taste. So let's move on to the interior. So let's deep dive into this interior because I do have an update from my initial impressions video. So what I said in that video is that the interior is overall great, especially for a sports car. I mean, I definitely consider this a pretty hardcore sports car. It has everything you need and is comfortable. Coming from a Subaru WRX or the Nissan 370Z, and those interiors are not that great. They're outdated, not that comfortable either. This is refined. You know, there's no creaks, there's no rattles, there's good materials everywhere you touch. But on top of that, you have the great seats, the great bolstered seats, and from autocross, they were fantastic. Honda made seats that are the correct way to make seats with bolsters. A lot of seats seem to kind of taper in towards you, the bolsters do, which can make your back a little uncomfortable because it's not up and down, it's tapered. This is exactly a 90-degree angle from the bottom of the seat and the sides of the seat, so that way it's not tapering into you, but it holds you in real well like in autocross. And in that initial video, I said that the seats, I wasn't sure about the long-term comfort for long-term rides. I've done a couple hour drives in these seats, and they're actually great. I've completely changed my mind on the concern of them not being extremely comfortable for those long-term trips. My main point was the lumbar and the lack thereof, but I think my back has just adjusted to that, and it's actually okay. The initial impression review was done, you know, in the first couple weeks of the car, where I think after 6 months I've really adapted to it and it's perfectly comfortable. So outside of all of that, this really has everything I need. Like I said, the Android Auto, everything's where it should be. It's comfortable, and even comparing it to like my wife's Mercedes A220, I have no gripes with this interior compared to that. Honestly, I'm just as comfortable in this interior as I am in that interior. The only difference there is that this obviously isn't as quiet. So they removed sound deadening in this car to make it lighter. That's normal. Mercedes is doing the exact opposite. They want you to be completely removed from the road. So when it comes to actual comfort, especially in this adaptive suspension, when you put in the comfort mode on the highway, there really is no difference between this and my wife's Mercedes in pure comfort. I think they're both extremely comfortable. What it really comes down to is that this is loud on the highway because you have the wind noise hitting the mirrors. You have the noise hitting the road noise from the tires and other road noise. We're in the Mercedes, we just took a very long trip in that, and it's extremely muted in that car, very quiet at highway speeds. That's the big difference there. So overall, this interior is more than I would expect from a sports car, and I'm very happy with it. Okay, so now it's time to take a drive and really discuss those two things that I wanted to talk about earlier that are really my big key takeaways from 6 months with this car. And actually, before we get into those two things, I just thought of this, is the winter driving very quickly. So when I got this car, I got home the next day, I put on winter tires because it was winter, went through a couple of really big snowstorms. Now this is front wheel drive, different from my Subaru, which had the all wheel drive, but this does have a limited slip up front. So front wheel drive, limited slip, snow tires. It was perfectly fine. I had no problems at all going through those storms in this car. Never had a problem with getting started with traction. I never had to start on an enormous hill with the snow, so that could be a point where maybe it would struggle. I just can't speak to that. What I can speak to is I was visiting my parents, and there was a steep hill in their development that I took up at around like maybe 15-20 miles an hour going up that hill, and it did fine with all that snow. But again, starting on the hill might be a different story. But I probably drove a couple hours worth through these storms with the snow tires, and it is perfectly fine. Honestly, it's all about tires. It really is. So as long as you have really good tires on your car, even in rear wheel drive, you can do pretty well. So overall, snow driving, very good in this car. So like I said, I got this car. I put the winter tires on it the very next day and drove for multiple months in the snow, in the cold with winter tires. So I never got to truly experience the handling and the characteristics of this car for those first few months. It just drove like a normal Civic, and that was fine. But it was about early March. There was no more chance of inclement weather, nothing really coming up. So I put on these summer tires, and that same day I actually went to the driving range with my buddy, and it's about a half-hour drive to our nearest range. And on the way to that range is some great twisty roads. So I took it on there for the first time in actual good tires, and I was blown away with the handling. The lightness of this car, in conjunction with the extremely low profile tires, made for such a direct and responsive steering and handling that I was absolutely impressed with it more than any other cars I've previously driven. I mean, it by far was the most direct and quick to handle and responsive steering I've ever had in a car with those tires on those roads. So these tires, or these wheels and tires, are 20-inch with a very, very low profile, and it's really just every single millimeter you turn this wheel, it's instantaneous and direct, and it was incredible. Now, the actual steering feedback is not quite as good as it is in my Z, just because I believe the reason for that is this is electric power steering, my Z is hydraulic, and there's a little more feel. But this car feels extremely light, extremely nimble, and is definitely the best handling car that I've ever driven up to this point. So from there, I was obviously very excited to get this car to autocross. I never took my WRX to autocross, but I took my Z multiple times, and I really wanted to see how this performed. And to make it really simple, in my class of 14 cars that day, I came in second. And I came in second overall for PAX time, which is really kind of like takes in your handicap into effect, so how fast your car actually is, it adjusts your time. And also second overall in that class for timing, beating out everybody, including one Corvette, but only losing to one other Corvette. So when you're at autocross, you really do find the limits of your car even more, and where you can actually explore that handling characteristic. And what I really found out is that this thing actually has a lot of liftoff oversteer, especially when you turn off all the stability and traction. So in this car, you put it in plus R mode, and you can hold down the traction control button for 2 seconds. It turns traction fully off, and it turns stability control into off mode. It's really bizarre, because then you can hold it for 10 seconds and it'll turn to stability into full off mode. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is. I believe all it does is it brakes in just off mode. It will still brake the rear tires to possibly prevent an oversteer slide or make the car rotate a little bit more. So just to wrap up this handling portion and really drive home my thoughts on it, is that this car is really on a knife's edge, where it's so light and nimble and extremely direct that it's incredible in that sense of the handling, but also at the limit, it really has its own characteristics where it has that lift-off oversteer. Going through the slaloms and autocross, I had in my first 4 heats, I had the stability on, or stability off, so it wasn't fully off. And now going through the slaloms, I had some lift-off oversteer. The rear brakes kicked in and corrected me. In the last 2 runs, I actually had it off and had to correct my own lift-off oversteer through the slaloms. So this car has the wonderful involvement, direct steering, and amazing handling and lightness in most situations that I love, but really at the limit, you can still rotate this car and get it around, and had just a wonderful time with this at autocross. So now that I've beaten that horse to death, let's talk about my biggest gripe with this car after 6 months, and that unfortunately is the front wheel drive. So let's start with why Honda made this front wheel drive and some of the good characteristics about it. So I think Honda was really going for the ultimate track car and lightness, right? So you save a couple £100 probably by not having gear running to the back, and you have that extra lightness that will help you for a good track time. Especially if you're on an actual big track higher speeds, where grip doesn't really matter when it comes to putting the power down. You're always going to be at least in second or third gear, so the power will go down fine, but you have lighter weight for better handling, and overall just better performance. And I'm not sure if it still is, but I know at one point this was the fastest front-wheel drive car ever around the Nürburgring, and I know Honda put that out there. So front-wheel drive has its place, and I think I understand why they did it, but let's talk about why I don't like it. So I knew this car would be pointless in first gear, and it really is. The first gear in this car is pointless. And when I put on the snow tires, you had first gear, you blow the tires off, and then second gear, same thing. I put on the Summers really thinking that second gear would grip, and it doesn't really. Second gear really doesn't unless the tires are extremely hot. So on normal roads, normal driving, even when you've been driving for like a half hour, you still kind of blow the tires off this thing. You might find some grip if you gradually go into it, or if you are kind of, you know, halfway through the RPM range and you start gradually putting your toe into it. But it really doesn't have tons of grip in second gear either, and it's very, very frustrating. And sorry I keep going back to this, but when I was at autocross, second gear, when the tires started to heat up, especially after my first run, I was actually gripping pretty well in second gear, and it wasn't too bad. So it didn't matter too much. It was really just off the line in first gear when you do a standing start in autocross that I was spinning them. So for the rest of the run in second gear, I was pretty good. But on the street, I can't seem to get that grip. And for example, here's second gear right here. Let's see. Hold on. And there it is. Yep. So the lights come on the dash. The traction thing starts flashing at you that you don't have traction, and it just kind of, it's searching for grip that whole time. And here's why it's a big gripe for me. So this car handles extremely well, and a lot of that could be due to the lightness, saving a couple 100 pounds, not going all-wheel drive, and just having this be front-wheel drive. However, I'm not tracking or autocrossing this car all the time. I mean, 98% of this car is going to be on the road. And something I've really learned to love, or what I realized that I do love, I thought that handling was the biggest thing for me when it came to cars. I loved how my Z handles. I loved going through turns fast. But I never really realized, I think, until I got rid of my WRX and had my first high-performance front-wheel drive car, how much I miss doing just stupid second gear or first gear pulls. I have a roundabout by my house. I'm always going through that, and then after the roundabout, it's a big straightaway, and I always do like stupid first or second gear pulls out of that in my Subaru, and you just get power and you get surge and you get pushed forward, and it's fun. It's just a lot of fun, and I miss that a little bit. So I think for a lot of people, especially if you're not a huge track person, and I'm not. I mean, I go to autocross, but not nearly as much as a lot of people do. I think you might miss that, and I definitely do. And I truly believe that if this was all-wheel drive, this would be like almost my perfect car. You know, everybody's different and they're subjective with all their cars, but I want like some 350 horsepower all-wheel drive hot hatch. And it's harder to find those these days, especially, you know, in a stick shift too. You know, you've got the STI. I'm just not a huge fan of that old engine, of the old EJ, of, you know, the interior, a lot of things. This has the refinement. This has refinement that and fun and handling that I don't think you can find anywhere else. You look at like a Golf R that's got the, you know, same power as this, but has all-wheel drive. You can still get it in a stick. I don't know if the handling would be there. I haven't driven one personally. I've driven GTIs, not Golf Rs. My wife had an Audi A3, which is just a GTI with all-wheel drive. That's all it is. And I don't think those would handle as well as this. If this car had all-wheel drive, it would be the perfect package, and I can see myself having it for a long time. But just because of that lack of all-wheel drive and not being able to just be stupid at stoplights and just do like pulls and just feeling those G-forces hit you, you know, from a standing start, I think I'm still going to just look around in the next year or two and see what's out there, especially with, you know, the new STI, WRX and STI coming out. I'm really interested to see what that new STI does. Hopefully it handles really well. It sounds like they're going to replace that old EJ engine, which is my biggest gripe with that car right now. If it handles well, it has a new engine and all that, there's definitely a possibility I could trade this in for that. So that is my big gripe with this car from a streeting it perspective. I think at autocross, I don't care that I'm blowing the tires off in first gear, whatever, I think it just handles so well that it overshadows that at autocross. I think it would at the track as well. But when it comes to just most people drive on the street all the time, and it really bugs me that's not all-wheel drive on the street. So that's it. After 6 months of ownership, I'm absolutely loving this car. And the best way to summarize it is absolutely exceeding my expectations in like every single aspect, except for the all-wheel drive thing that I talked about. And that's not a gripe on it, because it's not failing at that, because it just isn't all-wheel drive. So it's front-wheel drive car. It's designed to be that. It's just that I think it would almost be the perfect car for me if it had that all-wheel drive for the street use, but it doesn't. So aside from that, if you take that out, it's honestly exceeding my expectations everywhere. And after 6 months, I'm absolutely loving it. I appreciate you guys watching. I hope you enjoyed the long-term update. There'll be more of those, so subscribe if you like videos like this, and I'll see you in the next one.